Hello everyone. Today's lecture will cover the extensive transformations wrought in Central Europe during and after the First World War, as three great empires, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia, collapsed, leaving a bundle of new states in their wake. The people of Austria-Hungary suffered greatly during the war, with incompetent generals leading to great loss of life at the front, and the Allied naval blockade creating massive food shortages at home. Vienna, a thriving metropolis before the war, now became run down and shabby, overwhelmed by a wave of refugees arriving from the front. Food became scarce, and bread lines stretched around city blocks. A giant strike erupted in the city in January 1918, coinciding with a similar strike in Germany. Protesters demanded an immediate end to the war, and only backed down when promised a reformed food rationing system and greater participation in democracy. Austria-Hungary was clearly on its last legs. In November 1916, Franz Josef, who had reigned since the 1948 revolutions, finally passed on of pneumonia. Franz Josef had become a pillar of stability in the course of his long reign, and was one of the few institutions keeping the disparate Habsburg realm together. He was succeeded by his well-meaning but slightly incompetent heir, Karl, who sought peace with the Allies. Unlike the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, who called for a general peace involving the Germans, Karl wanted a separate Austro-Hungarian peace as a means to keep most of his empire intact. The French leaked Karl's request as a way of stirring up discontent between Austria-Hungary and Germany, and this worked. The Germans were outraged and placed the Austro-Hungarians under close watch. For the rest of the war, Austria-Hungary would be run as a German puppet state. One successful front for Germany and Austria-Hungary had been in the east, where, in 1917, the Russian Empire disintegrated entirely. At first, the so-called provisional government that succeeded it vowed to continue the war. However, Russian morale was low, and the Austro-Hungarians were able to make a number of successful counter-offensives. By the end of the year, the provisional government had itself been overthrown by Lenin and his Bolsheviks, who called for an immediate armistice. At the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, Russia was forced to hand over wide swathes of land to Germany and to German client states in the Baltic and Ukraine. The German High Command intended to exploit this land to feed their citizens and supply their troops, in a chilling precursor of the horrors later to be visited upon the region. Brest-Litovsk is interesting in that it gives us a brief snapshot into a world where Germany won the World War. The terms harsh on Russia, which soon became the Soviet Union, stripped it of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. New states were planned on being formed in all of these regions, in which a small German elite was to dominate and ensure compliance with German demands. Even so, many nationalists in these countries, as well as ordinary people who disliked the Russian Orthodox religion and the Cyrillic alphabet, were happy to see the Russians go. Some, however, continued to fight against the new German occupiers, extending the period of warfare in the region and preventing German reinforcements from leaving for the Western Front. The entry of the United States into World War I was a disaster for Austria-Hungary, not only because they had a new enemy to face on the battlefield, but also because of the ideas espoused by President Woodrow Wilson. In his famous 14 points, outlined in January 1918, Wilson called for self-determination for all of Europe's nationalities. This left no room for the multi-ethnic monarchy of Austria-Hungary, and it was increasingly clear that, should the Allies win the war, Austria-Hungary would disappear from the maps of Europe. In October 1918, Emperor Charles issued the so-called Imperial Council, in which each national group had a say in how the empire was run. However, the national groups, sensing blood, all began to push for autonomy and were soon largely running themselves. The Czechs were among the foremost opponents of the emperor. A leading Czech figure, Thomas Masaryk, had a very West European outlook, and indeed had spent the wartime years in Western Europe. Here he founded the school in which I myself attended as an undergraduate student, the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies in London. More importantly, he also began planning a political union of the Czechs and their neighbours, the Slovaks, establishing contact with Czech and Slovak emigrants living in Allied countries and in the United States. In 1916, Masaryk founded the Czech National Council, later renamed the Czechoslovak National Council, in Paris. In May 1918, he was in the US to win support from emigrant organizations. From Pittsburgh he issued a declaration in favor of political union of the Czechs and the Slovaks, containing a guarantee of Slovak rights to their own parliament, legislation, and administrative language. Allied leaders were now coming around to the idea of a Czechoslovak state. France recognized the Czechoslovak National Council as the supreme body controlling Czechoslovak interests. The other allies soon followed the French initiative. On September 28, 1918, Czech nationalist and Francophile Eduard Beneš signed a treaty whereby France agreed to support the Czechoslovak program in the post-war peace conference. The Czechoslovak National Council then constituted itself as a provisional government on October 14th. 4 days later, Masaryk and Beneš issued a Declaration of Independence simultaneously in Washington, D.C. and in Paris. Czechoslovakia, not even a dream in 1914, was now on the verge of being an independent state. Another new state that was to emerge from the Habsburg shell was Yugoslavia. Whilst many Croatians were loyal to the Habsburgs and fought bravely against both Serbia and Italy, dissent with Hungarian domination and the lack of Croatian representation in the empire rose as the war progressed. On top of this, the Croatians looked with fear at the Allied promises to give Italy the Dalmatian coastline in the event of victory, as these lands contained a majority Croatian population. Exiled Croatians began making plans with their Serbian counterparts for a unified South Slavic state to include themselves, Serbians and Slovenians in the north. In July 1917, the leaders of this so-called Yugoslav Committee and representatives of the Serbian government in exile signed the Corfu Declaration, conceived of as a constitutional monarchy, announcing the intention of founding at the end of the war a unified South Slav state, conceived of as a constitutional monarchy under the Serbian monarch. This declaration did not, however, specify whether the new state would be a federation of equal partners or whether it would merely represent an extension of the Serbian state. With the Habsburg monarchy collapsing, the peasantry in revolt, and the Serbian and Italian armies advancing toward Croatian territory, the Croatian parliament voted in October 1918 to break relations with Austria-Hungary and declared the unification of the lands of Croatia, Dalmatia and Slavonia into an independent Croatian state. After this, it quickly announced the incorporation of Croatia into a South Slav state and transferred its power to the newly created National Council of Slovenes, Croats and Serbs. In November 1918, representatives of the National Council, the Yugoslav Committee and the Serbian government together signed the Geneva Declaration calling for the establishment of a South Slav state with a form of government to be decided by a National Constituent Assembly. On December 1st, 1918, delegates of the National Council met Serbia's regent, Alexander I, to affiliate themselves to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. Maneuverings, rigged elections, and the selective use of violence also ensured that previously independent Montenegro would become part of this new kingdom, which, in 1929, would take the name Yugoslavia. In November 1918, Poland, long conquered and divided, re-emerged on the map of Europe. In 1917, both Woodrow Wilson and the Russian Provisional Government had recognized the right of Poland to exist as an independent state. Wilson's 13th point declared that an independent Polish state should be re-established and enjoy secure access to the sea. The Allies endorsed Polish independence in June 1918. A Polish National Committee under the leadership of Roman Dmowski had been founded in 1917 in Paris. The French viewed this committee as a quasi-government similar to their attitude towards Czechoslovakia. In the chaos of 1918, however, it was Pilsudski, who we last heard of as being locked in a German prison, who entered Warsaw, having been freed by German revolutionaries. On November the 11th, the same day as an armistice brought the war in the West to a close, Pilsudski declared Polish independence. Pilsudski successfully negotiated a German evacuation of Poland, but quickly fell out with Dmowski's Polish National Committee, which refused to recognize his authority. Under a compromise implemented in January 1919, Pilsudski remained head of state and commander-in-chief, and Dmowski was allowed to represent Poland at the Paris Peace Conference. In the east, the Ukrainians, having proclaimed their own republic, battled the Poles for independence. The Poles also soon came into conflict with the Bolshevik forces, who were advancing from the east. Polish victory over the invading army in the Polish-Soviet War guaranteed the independence of their country, whilst preventing the spread of the Russian Revolution further west. A messy border was established between Poland and the Soviet Union, who divided Ukraine and Belarus between them. Following Germany's failed spring 1918 offensive, as well as concurrent failure of its attempts to starve the UK from the war, victory seemed remote. A wave of strikes and mutinies in the fall of 1918 led to the abdication of the German Emperor and the declaration by the Social Democrats of a democratic republic. Whilst conflict ended on the Western Front, however, it continued in the East, where chaos reigned. Detachments of German troops stationed in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe lent themselves to a number of causes, from Ukrainian independence to the establishment of an independent German state in the Baltics. Returning to Germany, these veterans played an important role in the establishment of the so-called Freikorps, right-wing organizations which attacked rioting trade unionists and left-wingers. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war with Germany, saw the country lose lands to France, Belgium, Denmark, and Poland. The German state was allowed to keep rich Silesia, where a referendum just about resulted in a pro-German victory. The Polish border in the west would seem as temporary as that in the east, with Germans particularly resenting the ugly Polish corridor, which divided historic East Prussia with the rest of the German Republic. German nationalists were outraged at the terms of the treaty and promised its overthrow. They resented the idea that Germany had been somehow responsible for the First World War. The fact that democratic politicians signed the treaty stained the reputation of democracy in Germany, as it was now associated with cowardice and defeatism. The Freikorps, meanwhile, brutally suppressed a number of communist uprisings with the tacit approval of the Social Democrat government, and executed the revolutionary heroes Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Austria-Hungary disappeared forever, and with it the Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled from Vienna for 700 years. By the end of October 1918, the Hungarians declared that their participation in Austria-Hungary was at an end. A Hungarian republic was declared, and then a communist state under Bela Kun. Neither would last very long. Hungary was divided up at the Treaty of Trianon, ceding lands to Romania, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. The rump, landlocked Hungarian state was a shadow of the state that Hungarian nationalists continued to dream of. It became a dictatorship under the leader of a former Austro-Hungarian admiral. Emperor Charles renounced his right to participate in politics in the rump German-speaking state left under his control, but was careful not to directly abdicate. The following year he left the country and was forbidden from ever returning. In fact, the new mountainous republic of Austria banned any Habsburg from ever setting foot inside the country again. Austria was itself banned by the Allies from joining Germany, and this small, politically unstable and impoverished republic would last just 15 years before itself becoming a dictatorship.